When I begin my course on prehistoric life, I begin my students to imagine that they're walking along with a friend along the trail and they find one of these objects, but to imagine that they were living centuries ago. And then if you looked then at this object and then described it to your friend, what would you say? Well, many of my students will then say, oh, here's the remains of an ancient animal or so. And the first response would be, no, you wouldn't have said that. And that's because up until very recently, one of the ideas that people had about life was that it could be generated spontaneously, the idea of spontaneous generation. So if you looked at, little fish or tadpoles or larvae of flies, say in garbage, et cetera, and if you asked, where did this stuff come from? The answer would have been, well, that's just what water does. When water gets mixed with sunlight, well, you just get little fish. Or when you mix garbage with air, you expose the garbage to air and you'll get these fly larvae. Or, oh, there's wet sawdust um, in your barn. That's where the mice came from. Or, just mud, can form tadpoles, etc. And when I say this, I'm not saying that, there were people, in the Middle Ages who didn't get a chance to go to school who held the idea of spontaneous generation, the idea that all of this could have come from the mud, the water, in the absence of life, that the non-living world can give rise to life all the time. That's what was believed. It wasn't just those, who did have a chance in the Middle Ages to attend school. No, the great minds of past centuries argued for spontaneous generation, whether these be Greek philosophers or religious philosophers. It was the general consensus, including among the most learned, that life could just spring from mud, from water, from garbage, from the non-living world all the time. Now, if that is your idea of life, that all around us, life is springing from the non-living world, then it really isn't that far of a stretch to think that this is then not the remains of a living thing. If mud can form a fish, well, then here's mud that just went halfway and made the impression of a fish. Actually, if you look at this, there is no bone here. It's rock in the shape of bone. All right, there's no chitin or, the remains of the exoskeleton of an arthropod here. It's rock in the shape of an arthropod. And so a common idea was simply that, since mud and water, et cetera, can form actual life, that any fossils that you might find were, kind of tricks of nature, sports of nature, that nature's just kind of fooling around, going halfway instead of forming an entire living thing. And so a lot of people wouldn't have gone to the length and said, this is the remains of a living thing. Let's say you did, however. You said, I think that this is once alive. What was it? Well, until fairly recently, it was common enough to believe in dragons, in giants, in unicorns, in many things which are thought now to be more on the mythological scale. And so when people found bones, whether they be, and they did, find bones, the bones of, for example, the giant primate Gigantopithecus found in caves was attributed to dragon bones. Some of these might have, these beliefs in dragons, et cetera, might actually stem back to ancient animals which early humans actually encountered. So for example, I was in the Peace Corps in Paraguay for several years, and there was a mythological feature that the Guarani American Indians believed in called the owl, a giant sloth-like creature. So today we would attribute it to mythology. But when the first Native Americans reached South America, there were elephant-sized giant sloths that they probably hunted. So, maybe some of these actually, come from, remembrances of mammoths and giant sloths and things which once lived. But in any case, say, the Middle Ages up until a couple centuries ago, people believed in unicorns. People believed in dragons. Many even had then religious reasons to do so. They could refer to certain religious texts which mentioned dragons, or which even mentioned unicorns, and would say when a fossil was found that. Here we believe in unicorns, dragons, giants, and the like. Here in our religious text, we find references to these things. When mammoths' bones were uncovered, it is thought that the word mammoth is a Russian derivative of behemoth, a biblical reference to a giant creature of some sort. So when one found giant large bones or large fossils, one could attribute it to these mythological creatures of unicorns, dragons, and the like. Many fossils were originally thought to be giant people. So there were dinosaur fossils, which were originally thought to be giant people. There was a giant salamander of, say, a 5-foot-long salamander found that was given a name, Homo diluviae testis, man, the witness of the flood. So there was a salamander which was attributed to be a person, and individuals going back. We think this is true of many discoveries found ages past. But then even going into more recent centuries in the colonies of North America, from the Puritan philosopher Cotton Mather, that when remains of mastodons and mammoths were found, that these were interpreted to be giant humans. All right. So the idea that, if you found the remains of a giant elephant, you wouldn't have said, oh, here's a giant elephant. It might have lived long ago. That you might have said, oh, I think, this is a giant human. And since elephants have their nostrils are fused here in their forehead, which is at the base of the trunk. This is where the legend of Cyclops came from. So people would find these elephant heads with a big hole here, and they would say, oh, this looks like a giant person. And look at that one eye, they must have had a median eye. So then the second step is, if you felt that these things were once alive, that you wouldn't necessarily have then gone to the conclusion of that they were elephants or salamanders, etc. That you might have gone to unicorns, dragons, and the like, since that was part of the mythological pantheon of the time. And then last question I would ask my students is, let's say you found a mastodon, because where I teach at Orange County Community College, there's a mastodon discovered in Orange County. Orange County actually has a rich history of mastodon discoveries. Would that make you afraid to go home? And many would say, no, of course not. I mean, because they're extinct. They don't live in Orange County anymore. But once again, I would then go back and say, well, no, a couple centuries ago, you wouldn't have thought that. You wouldn't have thought that here was an animal that was once alive, that I think it is extinct now. And the reason is because the idea of extinction is kind of new. It was really only like, the end of the 1700s, the beginning of the 1800s, that science began to accept. I think, some animals have disappeared and are no longer with us. Now, part of that would be because, until recently, you could still make the argument, in Zaire or Brazil, that much of the world was undiscovered. So you could always argue that, maybe these are still alive, but just in that unexplored part of this continent. Also, many attached, religious value to this, where if you said, oh, I think this animal went extinct, you could actually get in trouble, right? Because, people might say, well, wait, what are you saying about my God? Are you saying my God made a mistake? Are you saying my God made something that didn't live? If all of this animal life was created for me, all right, if the world is created for humans to benefit from, and humans are still here, then why would this life then become extinct? There was a gentleman, Palissy, who made the argument that I think that these fossils that I'm finding are of animals which lived long ago and are no longer here. Well, he was thrown in prison until he died. So, saying that, oh, I think these animals were once alive and are extinct now, that was a problem. Then there was also this other train of thought. So speak of Thomas Jefferson briefly. Thomas Jefferson was obviously interested in science, and here's a giant sloth. There was a giant sloth species which Thomas Jefferson described and analyzed for the budding Philosophical Society of Philadelphia, where it's on display and part of their rich history, and it's named after Thomas Jefferson. So Jefferson was clearly interested in fossils, but Thomas Jefferson, like many of the day, had this romantic idea of a great chain of being. They felt that like all of the living things on Earth were kind of like links in a chain, and if you broke one, then the whole chain would fall apart. So extinction was impossible because everything was so interconnected that if one thing died, the rest of the world would unravel. Now, Jefferson was not alone in thinking this. Alexander Pope had, a very beautiful, moving poem on this. So it was thought for a long time that extinction was impossible, and many took exception to it. They thought, it was an affront to their religious beliefs. And like I said, it wasn't until, say, the late 1700s, early 1800s, that people began to realize, hey, these mammoth bones we found, these mastodons, I think we would have noticed if they were still here. But since much of North America wasn't described, like Jefferson, after the Louisiana Purchase, when Lewis and Clark went to explore it, Jefferson told them, hey, we've been finding these mastodon and mammoth bones, be careful, be on the lookout, because once again, the idea of extinction wouldn't sink in. For example, there was an American botanist, John Bartram, who would go on field trips and discover plants, and then he would go back and they weren't there anymore and he couldn't find them. It was at that period in the late 1700s where the idea of, I think organisms can die off the planet and never, and then just be gone, that was when that started. And so I say this because people have been finding fossils, for as long as there have been people, but our interpretation of them is new. Until recently, people have held the idea that when you find a fossil, it's just mud partway on the way of becoming life. Maybe it's a dragon or a unicorn, or maybe it's a giant person. But if it was an animal, well, certainly it isn't extinct because extinction is impossible. Until recently, that's what people thought of fossils. Now, one of the keys, as I'll be going through, is that the realization came upon that the Earth is old. Now, you could say, we all know that the Earth is old, but until recently, when someone said, well, how old? Old would have meant, a couple thousand years, 4,000, 10,000, something like that. We now hold that the world is 4.6 billion years old, which is just far older than most people would have imagined. And, it's kind of a similar thing to the universe. If you could have gone back a couple centuries and asked people how big is the solar system or the universe, they would have said, oh, it's huge. Those stars are probably a couple miles away from the surface of the Earth. Well, now we know, the universe is immense, so much bigger than what we originally thought. The first people thought that the universe was a small place and they were in the center of it. These same people thought that history was rather short. It kind of began with humanity, and humanity is kind of the center of history. But just as people learn that the universe is a big place, we're not in the center of it. And in the same way, we learned about time, that there is this, vast expanse of time, and that was kind of key to understanding that these organisms had not always existed. Okay. Now, when we ask, all right, well, if the planet is old, how old is it? When geologists first started to study the world, and the earliest geologists go back to the 1800s. Now, prior to that, people clearly studied rocks and the like, but no one said, this is my job. I study rocks. I'm a geologist. There were lots of reasons to hold that the Earth was older than previously thought. So the early geologists, especially a lot of the ones in England, began with the idea that the Earth was less than 10,000 years old. And the more they studied, they realized, wait a minute, that's just not matching what I think I see. Look at all of this erosion, say, on this mountain range. If you think of the Grand Canyon, it's, the erosion rates we know of, I mean, they couldn't have done this in 10,000 years. Look at all of this limestone from coral reefs, at the White Cliffs of Dover or other sites. That would have taken far longer, than this. If the oceans are becoming salty by the rivers introducing salt into the oceans, that would take far longer than 10,000 years. So there were all of these reasons that the early geologists started, to notice. The early physicists, like Newton, said, well, the Earth kind of bulges in the middle, and if to do that, that meant that it was semi-molten, when it was starting to spin. And if it was semi-molten when it started to spin, how long would it be until now? Longer than 10,000 years, given how much heat would have had to have been lost. So there were just all of these observations. There is no way that the planet is 10,000 years old. It has to be far older. Now, it wouldn't be then until the beginning of the 1900s that radioactivity could be used to come up with a precise date. All right, so it's one thing to say, wow, look at all this erosion, look at all this limestone, look at this, look at that. The Earth must be old. It's another thing to say that this fossil is 2 million years old or 80 million years old or something like that. So how do you get a number? Well, there are a variety of different techniques in dating rocks and fossils and the like. And the ones with radioactivity allow for absolute dating, where after analyzing a sample, you can come up with this fossil is this age. So here's a couple of examples. Carbon-14 is an easy enough one to understand. So while we while we live, we're eating carbon-based foodstuffs, some of which is radioactive. There are different isotopes of carbon, different forms of carbon. Carbon-14, unlike the more common carbon-12, is radioactive. So since you eat carbon-14, it gets worked into your biomolecules, your sugars, your fats, etc. So part of you is radioactive. Now, that means that as I speak now, every now and then a little radioactive particle shoots out of my body at the screen here. So my radioactivity goes down, but then I'll eat another meal today and I'll get it back. So while I'm alive, the amount of radioactivity in my body stays about constant, all right? But after we die, we stop eating, obviously. And now, as we start to lose this radioactivity, as the carbon becomes nitrogen, then the level of radioactive carbon in our bodies starts to decrease. But the key is it does so at a predictable, measurable rate. And so we speak of what's called a half-life, the amount of time for half of the radioactive carbon to then disappear as the carbon ejects particles and becomes nitrogen, all right? And so as a result, if carbon has a half-life of 5,730 years, and you could say measure that. For example, I mean, there are trees which we know of, which are almost that old. We count their tree rings. And then if you look at neighboring trees, I mean, just by tree ring data, for example, we can go back to say 10,000 years with a record. And so then you can then compare fossils, etc., found, which have carbon in them, to these scales which we can establish. So if the amount of carbon which is still radioactive in a sample decreases by half every 5,700 years or so, then a sample which is recently deceased still has about the amount of radioactive carbon that it would have while it was alive. If the sample now has half what it once did, then you would say, oh, this has about half the radioactive carbon. It's, about 5,700 years old that this thing died. If something's 11,000, then you would say, oh, that's, maybe gone through 2 half-lives. So it decreased in half, then it decreased in half again. So that's why it has a quarter of the radioactive carbon it once did, etc. The key is now, this is something objective, all right, where you can say, I ran the sample, I measured the amount of radioactive of carbon, and since carbon decreases at this predictable rate, that we can now come up with an estimate of how old this thing was. Now, just a couple of quick notes. Like anything, there are sometimes other considerations you need to take into account. So for example, is it possible that in this sample over here, there's contamination from another source? So for example, here's the sample that you're trying to date, all right? But if there's bacteria in the soil decomposing stuff, then when you get your sample to test for carbon, the bacteria which are alive today and have a high level of radioactive carbon, they could contaminate the sample. So it's possible, and so there are some critics who are like, oh, this person came up with a measurement and it was wrong. So so every measurement that is taken in any field, there are things that could contribute, to there being a contaminant or whatever, and so that's why that the individuals who do this, it's practice. How does one, eliminate contaminants? How does one do this most accurately? I mean, that's true of weighing, anything. Now, note that the radioactive carbon, it decreases in thousands of years. And so, if you were to say, oh, let's date this dinosaur bone, with carbon-14 dating? Well, the answer is you can't, right? Because just like we have different kinds of scales, but if you were going to weigh yourself, you use this kind of scale. If you were going to weigh medication for a child, you don't use that scale in your bathroom, you use a different scale. If you were going to weigh a battleship, you use a different scale. So, no one scale is good to measure medication for a child, your body's weight, and a battleship. You would use 3 different scales. In the same way, radioactive carbon is very good at measuring things which are thousands, tens of thousands of years of age. But after a certain point, there's so little radioactive carbon left that this is not a useful tool to say date a dinosaur. Right? You couldn't date dinosaurs with this. Now, I have serious videos, I have some silly videos. So one of the things I ask my students is if an alien came to Earth and collected, a thing that died, at a certain point, and we can measure how much carbon is in it, using this graph. Let's say it's 30% of the carbon that this thing would have had when it was alive, and the alien would know that, but so if living things, this is the radioactive carbon in them, give or take, and we now have 30% of this, then if you extrapolated to the graph, what age would you predict for this, this object? All right. So like I said, there were different kinds of scales to measure different things. And in the same way, there are different types of radioactive elements which can be useful in dating. Radioactive carbon is one, but so is radioactive potassium. So radioactive potassium can be generated in igneous rock as, say, magma from the mantle is introduced to the surface where it solidifies and becomes rock. Now, as far as we can tell, the amount of radioactive potassium stays constant in the mantle from the radioactive decay of other elements. And so we have an idea of where radioactive potassium would start. And then once it becomes rock, it starts to decay and the amount of radioactive potassium starts to go down. So if the pink represented the radioactive potassium, so a really pink rock with a high level of radioactive potassium, that would indicate a new rock, which was just formed. And if, as the radioactive potassium goes down, this then is an older rock. But the beautiful thing about this type of dating and a couple of others is that you can check yourself, because you're assuming then that the radioactive potassium, which was in here, it started at this level and it decayed. Well, then the question is, what did it become? Well, radioactive potassium decays into argon. And argon is a gas. When a molten rock, solidifies from lava, any gas which was present at the beginning can escape. And so when this rock formed, there was 0 argon. But as more and more potassium became argon, then the level of argon increases. That will be depicted as green here. And so there are two things going on simultaneously. The potassium is going down, but the potassium is becoming argon, and the argon is going up. And so in your model, as you're setting up your assumptions, your calculations, et cetera, this is just a way of checking yourself. So for example, if there was a contaminant, if the nearby rocks are a source of argon, then that would cause anomalies. And you would say, I'm trying to date this rock, but something is wrong here. I think that, a nearby, source of argon might be, contaminating. And so, there's a way of checking yourself, which is, always good in science. And so you could then look at a series of rocks. Those which were the most pink and the least green, they would be the new rocks. They have a lot of radioactive potassium and not much argon. But as the potassium goes down over time, there's less and less potassium. As you go from 1 million years, 10 million years, 50 to 100, the argon then increases. There's more and more argon. And so now you can take 2 measurements from your sample. You can take a measurement of how much potassium is there, how much argon, right? And then now come up with an objective measure of age. And so as there's less and less potassium, there should be more and more argon. And then this allows you, because the half-life here is much longer, 1.3 billion years. All right, and so while radioactive carbon decreases by half in a short period of time, radioactive potassium much longer. And thus this is a scale which is much more useful to date older material. So while carbon-14 is most accurate when dating young material, potassium-argon dating is better for older material. And there are many other types of dating. So I go into a little detail here. There's far more here. So we can use uranium becoming lead. All right, so uranium 238 then undergoes radioactive decay to become lead-206. And that's, once again, useful because, here's a model and, you always check for errors and, assumptions. And so you can look for the, 238 measuring the level of 206. You can check for other forms of lead and other forms of uranium. And so here is a way that as this radioactive compound becomes less and less common, its daughter elements should become more and more common. Okay, and so then we just have all of these mechanisms then to absolutely date rocks. And so if an absolute dating of rocks gives you a number. So if you absolutely date something, you say, how old is this, this sample, and you come up with a number, then, this sample is 20 million years old, it's 100 million years old. That's what's known as absolute dating. The planet seems to be 4.6 billion years old. And we say that not because there are rocks on Earth which are 4.6 billion years old. The oldest thing we can find are these little zircons, which are 4 billion or just under 4 billion years old. But we don't think that when the Earth formed, it was solid. We think it was molten. And we don't think we have, the first Earth rocks. And so, at this point in our history, we've been able to date lunar material, even material which has come from the surface of Mars. And so from meteorites, lunar material, Martian material, we know that the solar system is a little bit older than the 4.0 billion year old stuff on Earth. It's 4.6. So we think that our planet formed 4.6 billion years ago. Now, that's great. But in science, and when I say to my students, I hold up a fossil, I say, this is 100 million years old. Who believes me? And then I say, and remember, I'm the one who determines your final grade. Who believes me now? So a lot of my class, they raise their hand. They raise their hand because they obviously want a good grade. And then I scream, and just to wake them up at this point in the class, I actually do scream. I say, no, 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 no. That's not what science is. All right. If someone asks you to believe them, you don't. All right. In science, nothing is true because someone says so. Nothing is true because I say so. My students, if they believe the things I tell them, they are not thinking scientifically. All right. So in science, nothing is true on authority because my teacher said, because the book said, because this website said. That's not how science works. If your teacher says something and you doubt it and you question it, it's not bad. Good for you. You're doing your job. It is your job to doubt and question, and then to say, where is your proof? What evidence supports that? So if I were to hold up, a fossil and say this is 100 million years old, all right, my students shouldn't say, I believe you, because if they do, they're not thinking scientifically. They're doing it wrong. They should say, where is your evidence? Is there another explanation? Is there another way we could account for that? If you do that, you're being scientific. That's your job. So what are the evidence for this? These absolute dates, how good are they? Well, it would be wonderful if we had time machines and could go back in history and, and say, I think this was formed, 100 million years ago. Let's set the dial on the time machine to 100 million years ago. Yep, I was right. See, the rock is forming. We can't do that. But we can do a couple of things. One, we can see if they're repeatable. All right. So if these dating techniques are measuring something real, then you should be able to go back and test it again and come up with about the same value, about the same date. Someone else should be able to test your sample and come up with the same date. Someone else should be able to use a different dating technique and come up with the same date. So, for example, there's some rocks in Greenland. They were dated by this one method, and at 2.5 billion years of age, 2.52 billion years of age. They were dated by lead dating 2.58 billion years of age, uranium lead dating at 2.53 billion years of age. Now, notice that as you go from sample to sample, like maybe they were like slightly different levels, so they might have been formed at slightly different times. But even if they weren't, even if this is one sample, there's a little error, 2.53, 2.52, 2.58. But the point is, we have a good idea. These rocks are about 2.5 billion years old. So it's like when you step on your bathroom scale, if it's off by a pound or half a pound, but you still get a pretty good idea of how much you weigh. All right. So this sample, then the dating of it was repeatable. You weren't having someone say, I think it's, this sample says it's 1,000 years old. This one says it's 1,000,000 years old. This one says it's 1 billion years old. They're repeatable. They're coming up with about the same date. Same thing here. If you're dating this strata where some fossils of hominids were found, using potassium argon dating, 1.83 million years old, 1.84 million, 1.85, 1.73, 1.83, 1.81. You have an idea. It's about 1.8 million years of age. All of the dating techniques are showing that. All right. Here's a moon sample, the same thing. So there are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of these absolute dates published in geologic scientific research papers where people take samples and measure their absolute age, then test it again, and then test, what the other, group published, et cetera, to make sure they get the same value. And so one of the things we can see here, these values are clearly repeatable. All right, so the more repeatable they are, if someone else could test your sample, perhaps even using a different type of dating, using your type of dating, using a different type of dating, and get about the same result, this increases the confidence which we have in absolute dating, because if the values were all over the place, then that would mean we don't have confidence in this. Now, there are some samples which are hard to date. So for example, let's say you're in a cave, all right? Now in a cave, there's rock, strata forming at the bottom of the cave, but you can also have stuff falling down from the roof of the cave. So now you have a sample that's actually a mix. So you might say, I'd like to absolutely date this stuff, but I can't, all right, because it wasn't formed at one specific age. You've got materials in it that came from different sources at different ages. So not everything can be absolutely dated, but just like I said, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of scientific research papers have demonstrated that these dates are repeatable. Are they reliable? All right, so reliable is different. Reliable is, can you make predictions based on these dates which turn out to be true? And the answer is yes. So for example, there are minerals which are valuable. All right, coal is valuable. So people go looking for coal. People go looking for petroleum, which is valuable. When individuals go looking for coal, petroleum, or other minerals, they don't just start digging holes. Say, oh, we didn't find one here. We didn't find one here. Instead, they would say, well, this area was seafloor, 500 million years ago or 100 million years ago. And that's when, we have found petroleum deposits. Let's look for rocks in this area, which are 100 million years old, because that would be the place to find these, petroleum deposits. And they do. All right. Now I'm going to talk about another type of dating, which is used in this as well, relative dating. But I always tell my students, if you can get home, driving your car using petroleum, or if you can heat your house using coal, that's evidence that these dating techniques work, because that's how a lot of these deposits are found. If you're looking for specific types of fossils, I want to find fossils of early amphibians. Well, you say, all right, well, now I know my fossils a little bit. I want to go to the Devonian period, 350 million years ago. So find me rocks which are 350 million years ago. I'm going to dig there. Look, I found a fossil like I was looking for. It turns out I made a prediction based on this dating, these dating techniques, which turned out to be right. This is where you found the petroleum. This is where you found the coal, the minerals. This is where you find that specific type of fossil. And so, once again, if you were to then survey scientific literature, you would just have tens and tens of thousands of research papers where these dating techniques are used to make predictions which turn out to be true. You expect certain fossils to be found, you expect certain minerals, et cetera, to be found, and it turns out they are. So these dates are repeatable, they are reliable, and given the incredible number of scientific research papers published on it, we have great confidence in these. Once again, nothing in science is ever held to be 100% absolutely true, and you are free to doubt, anything in science. In fact, that's your job. But nevertheless, saying anything other than there is an enormous amount of evidence which supports that these dates are accurate enough for us to make estimates of the age. Saying anything other simply does not reflect the scientific evidence. You can't, say that, it is true based on the evidence which has been discovered so far. There is another type of dating in which you don't use radioactive elements and you don't get a number. So you don't say, here is because of the amount of radioactive, uranium which is still left here, this is, 200 million years old. So instead, it's what's called relative dating. Now, there are some different kinds of relative dating. So I'd like to just kind of, go through some examples. So, for example, if you were digging in, archaeological digs, for, remains of, human civilizations, et cetera. So if you're in the United States and you find, say, Civil War paraphernalia, flags and guns and the like, in the remains of a house, well, you now have a pretty good idea of you would say, oh, I think this house dates from around the 1860s, give or take, because that's when this stuff occurred. If you then found Revolutionary War stuff, all right, then you would come up with a different date. I think this is 1700s. If you were in the old world and you found, a coin that had a head of a Roman emperor on it or an Egyptian pharaoh, that would give you an idea. I think that this sample is this old based on this coin, which comes from this time period. And then likewise, when we consider fossil animals, after we study them, we date them absolutely, we come to the realization that many of these jawless fish only lived in, say, the Cambrian period or the Ordovician period, or these, early plants only lived at, this time period, etc. And so just like you could say, oh, because of the Civil War stuff or the Revolutionary War stuff or the Roman coin, I think that this, house, was made in this year. Certain fossils then allow you to say, I think this dates to the Jurassic period or the Cretaceous period, or it's this old. So let's say we study all these meat-eating dinosaurs and we realize they did not all live, all throughout the geologic time period, nor did they live, if the Mesozoic era is the age of dinosaurs, they didn't all live together then. They lived in specific time periods. So some of these then lived only in the Triassic period. Some of these only lived in the Jurassic period. Some of these only lived in the Cretaceous period. All right. So every time we find one of these fossils, it dates to Triassic rocks. Every time we find one of these fossils, which you'll see again in a second, it dates to Jurassic rocks. Every time we find one of these fossils, it dates to the early Cretaceous rocks. And so these, just like the Egyptian pharaohs, come from a specific time in history. The Ming dynasty comes from a specific time in history. The Revolutionary War belongs to a specific time in history. Each of these dinosaurs seems to come from a specific time in history. And then, once again, just a little sillier, if this alien came to Earth and took a selfie of itself with this dinosaur, all right, because this dinosaur only lived at a specific moment in time, you get an idea of when, that sample, that selfie was taken. If the alien had taken a selfie with a different dinosaur, that would then give you a different idea. So that past example used dinosaurs. But once again, you can just find thousands and thousands of geologic publications where geologists study a specific group of organisms and study when exactly they existed in history in what's called stratigraphy. So if there's these different layers of rock sediment, you find that you don't have all of the organisms living in all of them. So we know that there are humans who lived in past history, but George Washington did not live at the same time as the Roman emperors, who did not live at the same time as the earliest, Egyptian pharaohs or founders of the Ming dynasty, et cetera. Like each had their own specific time in history, and historians map that out. So this type of, this period of history is when this happened, these people lived, etc. Well, the same is true of these biological organisms. So let's take trilobites, for example, a type of arthropod. They are only known from the Paleozoic era. So, and I'll go through the eras in a second. So the Precambrian, 0 trilobites. After the Paleozoic era, in the Mesozoic and Cenozoic eras, 0 trilobites. Trilobites are only known during the Paleozoic era. But there's all these different kinds of trilobites. So some people have done the stratigraphy. Which kinds of trilobites are known from the Cambrian period? And it turns out only some of them. Which types are known from the Ordovician period, the Silurian period? And so after this painstaking study, All over the world, the only places that these fossils are found is in the Cambrian period, starting 542 million years ago. The only times that these fossils were found is in this time period, etc. Now let's say, knowing this, after all of this work has been published in geologic journals, you find one of these fossils, all right? Well, you'd say, oh, because it's been published, the only time that these have been found is the Ordovician period. I think the rock that I found this in is from the Ordovician period. I think that the rock that I found this one in is from the Cambrian period, etc. And so this is what's called relative dating. I'm not using radioactive carbon to come up with a number. I'm saying, just like, a coin of a Roman emperor would say, I think this might have dated back to Roman times. This fossil, you would say, I think this dates to Silurian times. I think that this fossil dates to Permian times, etc. All right. Now, let me just give a couple other examples of how relative dating might work from my PowerPoint. Once again, relative dating is when we are not using radioactive elements to get a number, but rather so, for example, let's say you do a geologic study. You invest money, you do all of the sampling of absolute dates, and you then date this pink layer. I don't know, let's say it's 1 million years old. The blue layer underneath it is 2 million, the green layer is 3 million, et cetera. So you date all of these at site number 1. You then go to site number 2 and you say, hey, well, this gray stuff, I don't recognize that. But this layer reminds me of that layer. I don't know, maybe the fossils are the same, or the way magnetic north is pointing is the same, or the pollen is the same, the minerals are the same. Something about this layer, there's evidence of an inland sea, here and here. Something about this pink layer reminds me of this, pink layer I found over here. Something about this blue layer reminds me of this blue layer. About this green layer reminds me of this green layer. Well, then I would say, well, if I said that, if I showed, and my absolute dates, were conclusive, that this is 1 million years of age, then I now look at this pink layer and say, oh, I think it's about 1 million years of age, like this one. If this one correlates to that one, and this one was 2 million years of age, I think that one's about 2 million years of age. This is what's called relative dating, because I actually haven't measured radioactive elements in these. I've compared them to rock strata whose age I know. So because I know their age, and I use that as a comparison for this, it's called relative dating. Here's another example. Potassium argon works great as an absolute dating technique, but it works best when there's volcanic material, so volcanic eruptions don't constantly occur. So let's say, and this is based on actual finds, that there was a volcanic eruption here that we can date to 3.5 million years of age. There's a volcanic eruption in the gray area, which we can date to 4.2 million years of age. But the fossil that we found that we want to date is in the yellow area between them. We can't absolutely date that. But because it was formed after a rock strata, which is 4.2 million years of age, because it's on top of it, and because it forms before this rock layer, which is 3.5 million years of age, then we say, oh, it must be somewhere between 3.5 and 4.2 million years of age. That was a way of relatively dating the sample. Once again, if you always find, a species in the Mississippian period, then if and every time you absolutely date it, it's from the Mississippian, then if you found it at another site, you would say, oh, I found Archimedes communis. I think this is from the Mississippian period. These are ways of relative dating. Now, once again, if you're saying, how much confidence should I have in this? Good for you. You're thinking scientifically. That's what scientists are supposed to do, to doubt, to question. But then the answer is, then you look at the evidence. and the evidence is absolutely overwhelming. All right, and if you would like to become more familiar with the evidence, then you're going to have to read what geologists publish. There are lots of scientific journals where people who absolutely date strata publish their results, where people who do stratigraphy publish their results. Tens and tens, if not hundreds of thousands of publications on this support this type of dating. So once again, scientifically speaking, we should say, where is the support? There's an awful lot of it. So if you would like to draw a conclusion, how accurate is this? How much confidence do I have in this? Well, then that's good. You're scientifically thinking. But if you come to your conclusion without looking at the evidence, well, then you're not scientifically thinking. So feel free to make an opinion. It's just not a scientific conclusion that you're coming to. So feel free to refer to the places where geologists publish these results. So over the course of this semester, we hope to go through the history of life and geologic time, but put all of those dating techniques together. What picture does it paint? What does the history of our planet look like? Well, if you were to say, let's just, because I'm going to focus on life in this course, you're going to take all of these different types of living things. There's bacteria, there's yeast, and algae, there's sponges, there's jellyfish, there's primates, etc. If we were to look at geologic time, we first split time into what are called eons. All right, so there's what's called the Hadean eon, the Archean eon, the Proterozoic eon. All right, now a lot of people aren't familiar with these terms because a lot of times we'll put all of these three together in the generalized term, the Precambrian. So the Precambrian refers to all of this time, these three eons put together. But because this one starts 4.6 billion years ago, and this one is ending 500 million years ago, that this represents most of the history of the planet. So the Precambrian includes most of the history of our planet. Why do we bunch it all together in the Precambrian period? Well, from a biological point of view, what most people are interested in, like dinosaurs and human ancestors, etc. A lot of the Precambrian is just a little less interesting, to be quite honest, because for a while, and this is what I'll go through in subsequent lectures, for a while there's no life on Earth. So for about 500 million years, we have no trace of life on our planet. And when I said 500 million, a little bit more than that. There's no life on our planet. And then for about 1.5 billion years, there's life on the planet, but all it is bacteria, prokaryotic cells. And then for another 1 billion years, life gets more complex, but there aren't really any animals yet. There are things like algae and bigger cells. Towards the end of the Precambrian, we do get animals. There are traces of sponges and jellyfish and worms even. Maybe the ancestors of the first arthropods, so not a fly, they come later. But the first arthropod ancestors here in this yellow region. So the Precambrian takes up most of the history of life on Earth. Earth started 4.6 billion years ago. Life on Earth starts somewhere between 3.8 and 3.5 billion years ago. The Precambrian ends 500 million years ago. And during that time, life is much simpler than it is today. So all of the vertebrates that we know are only in this last 540 million years, the Phanerozoic eon. All of the plants on land only date from this time, etc. So most of the history of Earth is called the Precambrian, and most of our attention is on the more exciting things like the dinosaurs and the fossil humans and the trees and the forests. That's all the last 500 million years. So we can split Earth's history into these eons, and then we can split the Phanerozoic eon, the last 500 million years, into eras, all right? And so we have eras with different living organisms in each, so much so that, we call it old life or middle life or recent life. That's, because this living things which lived at one time period look different from another. And so the Phanerozoic eon, the last 540 million years, gets split into a Paleozoic era with old life, a Mesozoic era, the middle life, and then the Cenozoic era with recent life. All right, so we split this eon into 3 eras, and then we can split the eras into periods, and this is elaborated over the course of this semester. So the Paleozoic era gets split into the Cambrian, the Ordovician, the Silurian, the Devonian, the Carboniferous, the Permian. The Mesozoic era gets split into the Triassic, Jurassic, and the Cretaceous. And then the Cenozoic can be split into the Paleogene, the Neogene, and then into epochs. And we can take the periods and split them into narrower epochs, etc. And so people have been finding fossils for the longest time, but our interpretation of these fossils is far different from what most people have done, because we just know stuff that they didn't know. We know that life doesn't continually originate from mud, etc. We know that dragons and unicorns don't exist. We know that things can become extinct, and we also know that our planet is very, very old, and therefore many of these only lived at specific times in Earth's history. And so as we approach these fossils and the understanding of prehistoric life, our understanding then becomes very different from what most people have held.